Hi, I'm Jamie. It's so nice to meet you.
Hi.
And I'm Emily. This is my bookstore, and Jamie is the host of our Witches Who Resist book club.
This is my book club. I really appreciate you meeting with us so late. Also, side note, you have great hair, so I just want to mention that.
Thank you so much. You both also have fabulous hair, and thank you for having me. My cat is also like currently directly off screen, so she may be running by at certain points. But you know, she's an author too. Her name's Shirley Jackson.
Oh, so good. Amazing. Well, let's start, Payton, by you can just tell us a little bit about yourself and what inspired you to write the book.
Absolutely. Here she is. So I am an author, a programmer, and a film critic. I have been writing about film for about 5 years now. I take a political approach to that process. Originally, I wanted to be a sociologist. And then I realized that I could do that without like the math through media, right? Which is a cooler way to engage with history and with politics. It's the way most people get into those subjects. People come into consciousness when they start watching princess movies and feeling a little weird about it, or whatever that, moment for any particular person may be. And for me, that journey definitely involved witches. I grew up in Massachusetts. So, like witchcraft was kind of everywhere. This particular book was an even longer process. I worked on it. I started working on what would eventually become this book in college. And I started noticing a pattern in the horror films of the 2010s, where traditionally at the end of a witch movie, the thing that you come to expect is the witch gets burned at the stake, right? Like it's a historically conservative genre and people find like reclamatory readings of these movies, but the basic pattern is bad character has a really good time, gets destroyed at the end, and the queer viewers or the oppositional viewers of any kind really rock out for the middle part, and then we're all sad at the end. But in the 2010s, that pattern was broken in films like The Witch and Suspiria and Midsummer, and that really struck me, particularly since all of those movies involve neo-paganism and magic. And from there, I started looking at the political context around us, like what's spurring these things. And this is the height of the Me Too movement. This is the Women's March. This is the specific feminism that came about as a response to the MAGA movement. And from there, I was like, this is such a deep and potent subject that I really want to go all the way back as far as I can and trace that history in an American context to figure out not only like how we got here, but why this connection is so juicy. So many years later, here we are. And it spans, it starts in 1958. I give you some background, but really we jump in with the second wave and go all the way to the present. So it's hundreds of films, many, many presidents. And it's kind of a long, strange trip. So
it's such an interesting way to look at our cultural history and our legacy as queer people and witches and others. What did you say? Oppositional people or defiant people. And I wonder what it was like kind of watching all these movies in short succession. What did that do to you emotionally?
Oh, it's not. Yeah. When you watch as many movies as I already do, like I thought I was prepared for that kind of a process because when I'm doing film criticism or like I program for film festivals, and there are definitely days where I have to watch 3 feature films. And it does rot your brain. It certainly does. But even then I went in so cocky. I was like, I got this. And then in the 80s, like when I was writing about the 80s, everyone I know, I would show up to a hangout at 10 p.m., like hours after everyone else looking miserable. And they're like, what did you do today? And I was like, I watched 4 slashers on YouTube in 240p and they were all terrible. So it's like when the movies are bad, you suffer. When the movies are good, you thrive. But it was very much a, following the politics of the moment, right? Like talking about like in the 60s, I was having such a good time. And then in the 80s, I was having such a bad time, so ebbs and flows.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that background. I also thought I was going to be a sociologist at one point. I also was scared away by the math. Then I went on
many such cases.
Yes. then I went on to get a master's in education and thought I was going to be a teacher. And now I'm pursuing a PhD in women's spirituality to ultimately study witchcraft. So I have gone like that. But to me, it very much feels all connected, which I think is something you really like bring together in the book. A lot of the like feminist and witchcraft history was familiar to me, but the film stuff, not so much. I like know nothing about film. So it was really cool to learn more about that and like how it connects. I found myself definitely wishing I had started the book earlier and watched movies more as I was reading it, because I was like,
Sure.
I now want to watch all of these things. But I did go watch Rosemary's Baby because I had never seen that. And I'm so glad I did. That was amazing. And like you bring it up a lot. It seems like it's definitely like integral as you're kind of threading it through. And then I watched The Witch as well, and I had also never seen that. So I have questions that I noted while I was reading, and then some of them you kind of answer later in the book, but I'm going to ask them anyway in case you want to like elaborate on any specific parts.
Sure.
So my first is, I don't want to forget, I wrote them down. So you talk a lot about the cultural rise of witchcraft in the 1970s as a form of resistance and a growing spirituality and as a self-help trend, as well as how many people brushed it off as a fad rather than a legitimate spirituality or protest. I think we're seeing a similar trajectory right now in the popularity of witchcraft, and kind of like all of those sentiments happening at the same time. Can you speak to like why that might be happening and how you think we might be seeing that reflected in film and television right now?
Yeah, totally. I mean, witchcraft as a practice is really interesting because it's always been a combination of a symbol and an archetype on the one hand, and a practice that's either spiritual or medical on the other end of the spectrum, right? So it's the way it's kind of related to religion, like traditional, kind of hegemonic religion, or capitalism, really brings things into tension in a lot of complicated ways. Because on the one hand, a witch is a boogeyman who represents what Catholics in particular don't want women to be, right? On the other hand, she is a practitioner of a real spirituality. And you see that blossom more in the era that I'm starting with after the repeal of the anti-witchcraft laws in the 50s. You have kind of this flourishing of neo-paganism that comes from like a Wiccan tradition that, the Gardnerian Wiccans claim to come from an older practice, but like whether or not that's the case is complex. But, creating a folk history on the one hand in a space that was very much like associated with Halloween and a cartoon character basically really butts up against itself. And feminists used both of those symbols simultaneously. Like feminists were using the practice of neo-pagan spirituality at the same time that they were using the character of the witch that's used against them in a reclamatory way. So when you see these things come up into tension, it's not just on the feminist end, though. At the same time, it's like the conservatives who use witchcraft against itself are both speaking on religious terms, saying that this is an abomination against God, and they're using it to say like these women are ugly, or whatever it may be. So in the 60s, she was, as you were talking about, not only like, a spiritual source of anxiety, she was a political source of anxiety. She was also a Playboy pinup. There were so many sexy witches, not just in the movies, but in, literal Playboy spreads. She was a kind of happy housemate in shows like Bewitched that were used to sell soap. And she was like most teenage girls. I like to open a lot of my lectures on this book with the question, how many people in the room have a co-star app? Because it's so pervasive. Like at this point in time, we're just so familiar with the language of tarot and the language of astrology in the same way that we were in the 60s, right? And so all of these things coming together in the culture create an ambiguity that can be taken advantage of from all ends of the spectrum. So even though you have, in 2014, there was a Pew poll that marked a really tremendous rise in actual practitioners in America. That's since plateaued, and there's been a resurgence of Catholicism in particular, like trad Caths, right? But at the same time that you saw that rise, there was also an explosion, not just of witch talk, but like the witches of Etsy selling spells for tremendous amounts of money and causing some controversy within the community in terms of like, is that co-option? Is that helping? Are they really, is it some sort of extension of what like midwives were doing in the Middle Ages, like, going around the system and providing a service that's an alternative, right? Maybe. But at the same time, it also feels very overtly like exploitation. So those tensions just naturally arise when you have such a complex figure. But I think that kind of dissolution and this moment where it's kind of shifted out of the more explicitly political register, like I'm thinking about a headline from the most recent election cycle that was like, witches report their spells against Trump aren't working. He has a shield. That thing that got memed a lot. Like as the political kind of cohesion of the Wiccan movement and the witches in America kind of falls apart, you see a rise of this more poppy witch talk kind of figure because it still provides comfort. Like it's a catharsis, it's an expression of self that also reminds me a lot of, there's a feminist scholar named Barbara Ehrenreich who talks about the shift from yippies to yuppies in the 70s, and she expresses like self-help trends and like Jane Fonda's home workout tape in a really, I think, useful way, where she says if you can't change the world, you can change yourself. And so you shift from activism to fitness, right? So if you can't change the world through hexing, maybe you can change yourself through your tarot practice or like herbalism.
That is fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah. And yeah, that just has me thinking about just kind of the way that like within the witchcraft community, the way you see that this kind of like individualistic sentiment of like, you can use this to change your life versus you can use this to create community solidarity. And both of these things are happening. Yeah, it's interesting. Thank you. Do you have any questions or thoughts on that?
Yeah. I was kind of thinking a lot in watching this because I have, like, I'm the reader amongst my friends. So a lot of my friends, I think, engage and use and love these things, but they don't necessarily have the conversations around them. So and what I enjoyed about the book is like, you're obviously going through these like extreme decades of like all this stuff you have to understand, and it gives you a grounding basis to like go on that journey. But a lot of the people I'm around like love horror, and like I sit there and like I know what's happening in their lives, and then I see them finally cry when we're like they're 2 inches from the screen watching Wicked, like crying at that last scene. And also in the ways that kind of what you were just saying, that a lot of everything right now, but even the witchiness feels like if you don't know about it, your entry point would still be to purchase something. And like how else? So I guess I'm not good at asking specific questions, but I was curious about how sort of like other people around you reacted to this project, because I still think if you're watching a bunch of witchy, besides you being tired, there's both the act of sometimes my friends I think are like, you're thinking about it too seriously. You're taking it. I'm just here to like do this thing. And I'm sure there's many other mixed reactions, but like, how was it going back into community having like watched this whole series of things?
Great question.
Yeah, no, and it makes complete sense, right? In the same way that people meditate as a practice, right? It's like, I'm just trying to manifest and bring good energy into my life. Like, why do you have to be a downer? It's a valid sentiment for a deeply personal practice. In terms of the commercialist aspect, I think something that can be comforting, like I never want to call people out for that. It's a fact about witchcraft that it's something that's always been commercialized, right? But you can also go to like a Catholic store and buy yourself a saint and 17 votive candles, right? So like there's a commercial aspect to every spiritual practice on the one hand. On the other, witchcraft in particular, in terms of like cinema history, has always had that. So there's a scene in a 1973 witch film that I just adore, by George Romero, where she's like empowering herself, she's getting out from under her husband, and she goes to a witchcraft store and she gets a cauldron and a bunch of candles and a bunch of other stuff, and then right in the middle of the frame she puts down her master charge, right? So there's something interesting there as well, where it's like a way to express your agency within a capitalist system at the same time, like you're choosing to put your money into something for you. So it's more complicated than just saying like because it's commercialized, it's bad, right? We exist in a capitalistic context, so it's always going to be wrapped up in that in the same way. But I think thinking about this imagery and thinking about this history in a commercial context like film, which is fundamentally like movies are a commercial art form. They're there to make money. That's what makes them so useful as a tool to understand what's going on, because the creators of films are trying to predict what people want and reflect on what people are thinking, right? And in horror, it's like, what are we scared of? But I've gotten pretty good responses from the community. I think we're all grappling with that dichotomy between the singular practitioner and the coven, and where we can find solidarity and solace versus where we need to kind of collect ourselves in a moment of what's so obviously burnout. As there's this tremendous backlash to feminism, as there's this tremendous backlash to alternative spirituality, alternative lifestyles, identities of all kinds being repressed in a very systematic way. There's a desire to retreat into the self that can be fulfilled by a spiritual practice like any form of witchcraft, that we need to think about, right? And situate ourselves and try and find a way to reflect that outward again. But I do think like going internal is part of that process, as long as we can then take that history and arm ourselves with that knowledge and then bring it back out again and share it with the community. Because, you know, I mean, if you think about a lot of witch films, right, like in the craft or practical magic, right, like they can only do their spells together, and we're all more powerful together. So that's kind of how I think about it personally.
Yeah. The capitalist part about it makes me think of like this conversation I was in once where someone was talking about like the disgusting, you know, like beginner witch things you can get on Amazon, and like how it's such a travesty that these exist. And then someone was like, if that's like the gateway drug to get someone, like if that's what they have to, you know, start to like get someone to understand the more like deeper solidarity forming, community building, you know, earth centered things that are deeply anti-capitalist, then it's worth it. You know, we have to like forgive those little ways that it's, you know, monetized. And of course it's not awesome, but we have to start with that. Thank you for that answer. So my next question is that it was striking to me when I was reading just how even the witch films that you describe as being, you know, having sort of feminist messages, or even like their creators saying that they were setting out to make a feminist film, that they were pretty much exclusively created by men until very recently.
Yes.
And this wasn't necessarily surprising to me, but as a witch who is, I'm constantly trying to, you know, figure out where I stand with my philosophies and my spirituality. And I often run into trouble when I go down avenues and find that they originated with a man like Aleister Crowley or Jared Gardner or Alex Sanders. And it's like hard for it to resonate with me in like an authentic way at that point, once I like discover the history of some of these philosophies. So I was wondering if you could speak to any films, and I know you kind of get into this towards the end of the book. Some of these questions, like I said, I wrote when I was still reading, and then you kind of answered it. But can you speak to any films or books or television that you discovered in your research was the brainchild of a woman, and how that might have shaped the underlying message of the story? And for example, I found it really interesting that The Craft, which has a deeply feminist message in at least the first half of the film, was pitched by a gay man who you noted was quote, explicitly wanted the film to champion outsiders and people on the margins, and yet it ultimately fell short. So do you think these shortcomings decrease when the witch is delivered by a woman?
Yeah. So I think where I'd want to start is there are a lot of short films in the 1960s and 70s that are helmed by queer people broadly and some lesbians. So Barbara Hirschfeld's Transformations is a wonderful experimental short film about her commune, and it's just them performing a ritual and expressing joy, and it's really lovely. I think queer people and women in general had more space to express themselves in shorter form, more independent media than, like, you know, mainstream film for obvious reasons, right? But so you have a short film called The Wormwood Star by Curtis Harrington, who was a queer experimental filmmaker. He films with a poet and witch named Marjorie Cameron, who was a huge deal in like the LA scene. You also have Kenneth Anger's Invocation of My Demon Brother, which he like worked on with you know, Anton LaVey and a bunch of other people who were practicing Satanists. So there are these kind of undercurrents of marginalized history within that cinema history, but it does take a lot longer to break through by virtue of the structures of how film is distributed. The most obvious example of a woman-helmed witch film is Anna Biller's The Love Witch, which is just a fantastic film, very complicated in its politics, but fantastic. And then more recently, I actually wrote a paper on women-directed witch films that's coming out in the spring. It just didn't fit with the arc that I wanted to focus on here, but they're just doing something different. Horror is a genre to express anxiety. And so when people point out that a lot of these films are directed by men, typically I'll turn to a quote from, I think it's Barbara Creed, who says that these films represent much more the masculine anxiety than they do the feminine reality. And that says a lot, like knowing what men are scared of and finding catharsis in that expression of fear gives power to the feminine archetype in these movies, right? Like the concern in The Witch is that Thomasin can destroy the patriarchy, right? And that's really satisfying to watch, but that's not enough. And that's where films like The Craft Legacy or the remake of Black Christmas, both coming out in like the later 2010s and early 2020s, as well as Fear Street, are great examples of women and people of color trying to elevate these stories from a specifically feminist and feminine perspective. I think none of those films are quite as good as the best films in this book, but I think that's mostly a product of the fact that they're remakes or more mainstream or YA. Those directors in particular, the two who did The Craft Legacy and Black Christmas, were actually subject to really violent doxing campaigns and like Gamergate style harassment by virtue of their work here. So that says a lot about the power of these stories for women and by and from women. At the same time, you know, there are complications to all of that, right? Where films like those that are trying explicitly to present more feminist storylines still get kind of caught up in some of the tropes at the heart of witchcraft lore, right? Like questions of bioessentialism, questions of gender essentialism. We haven't worked out the kinks of how to fully express those things quite yet, but Alice Mayo McKay, actually, who's a fantastic Australian filmmaker, she's 20, she's done like 6 feature films already. Her most recent film, The Serpent's Skin, which is coming out this year, is a wonderful trans, like, charmed riff. It's incredible. So look out for that one. And Mother of Flies, which is also coming out this year on Shudder, it's like made by a family who makes movies together, and it's really centering like motherhood and dealing with grief and family in a really beautifully personal way. So in the same way that those early short films directed by women and queer people existed but were slightly more marginalized, you can find these excellent personal projects that I think work around some of the more masculinist impulses in the genre.
Right. I'm so glad we're recording this because I'm going to rewatch later and like write these down so I can go watch them. So thank you so much for all those recommendations. Do you guys have any thoughts, questions?
I guess this question is not as serious. But when you were watching the films, did you have any witch experiences that you related to more than others, or that you were like, yeah, that's my Like that would be my
Hmm.
pick a coven from your movies. Like
Oh, I love
who would
That's
you,
a good one.
who would you pick?
I mean, The Craft, like all I want is a squad like in The Craft before the nonsense. There was a film critic at the time who was like, if you want to enjoy The Craft, just turn it off after the bugs. Like last 15 minutes don't count, right? And there's a scene when they're doing spells in one of their bedrooms and they're watching Bewitched on TV and making each other levitate, and it's just like it's such a beautiful expression of the way you can build community and also have fun at the same time. But who else jumped to mind? I think if I were a teenager when I was watching these movies, the main witch in the film The Color Out of Space would be who I wanted to be. I would have wanted to be Lavinia when I grew up so bad. She's so cool. And the movie starts and she's like barefoot in the woods doing a ritual by herself. And I'm like in a cape with a horse. I'm just like, please.
And that was
Yeah.
the color, what? The color of
The
space.
Color Out of Space.
Out of space.
It's
Okay.
based on an H.P. Lovecraft short story. It's kind of weird. It's like sci-fi and eco horror all in one. Kind of a psychedelic situation. But she rocks. Oh, also the Hex Girls from Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost. Like that was they were who I wanted to be when I was like 8. So yeah.
My next question was about The Craft. I feel like you kind of answered, but yeah. So you kind of mentioned that the film kind of sells out in the end, right, on its feminist message, and you see the solidarity between the characters dissolve, and it focuses on the genuine magic of the upper class white girl as opposed to the more unstable and out of control magic harnessed by the other 3 more marginalized characters. What's interesting to me is that while you mentioned that critics accuse the movie of sending the message that, quote, kinky sex and the occult are bad, and you point out that the ultimate failure of The Craft is one of intersectionality, it seems that the initial message of empowerment and solidarity is what has endured as the message of the movie. You mentioned that Faruza Balk was a practicing Wiccan. Was that at the time during filming she was a Wiccan? Okay.
Yeah. And
I
2
didn't-
of the other actresses actually became Wiccans as a result of this movie. So
Okay,
love
so
that.
I was gonna say I
Yeah.
didn't know that. I already followed Rachel True on Instagram for a long time because I know she's like a very accomplished tarot reader now. So 3 of the witches are witches. You're telling us.
Yep. Mhm.
Exceptional.
Yeah. So it just seems like the positive aspects of witchcraft, it landed in that movie like so much more authentically with its audience and with the actresses apparently. So
Yeah.
why do you think that film was able to like capture that? And
yeah, I mean,
while we kind of sidestep the not so favorable stuff, you know?
yeah. So earlier I brought up the idea of the oppositional viewer. That comes from Bell Hooks, who's talking about it as the experience of being, in particular, a Black woman watching films and not seeing yourself or seeing yourself depicted in a really negative or demeaning way. The practice of identifying with a character who you're not meant to identify with and creating counter readings based on your personal experience is actually a really great way to develop media literacy, right? It's both like an identity statement and something that you have to do as a queer person or a person of color. And it just makes you better at understanding politics, subtext, and media. So you kind of have to become something of a film critic or a film sleuth to watch these things if you're a person who's not a cis white guy, who's kind of the main person being catered to in these movies. The case of The Craft is really interesting because Andrew Fleming is a queer man who did want to go in and create something for girls. He grew up in a very witchy household. It was an uphill battle to get this film made at all. And he actually had a witchcraft consultant on set. So he had a practitioner on top of Firuza Balk there to like help them along the way. So the intentions were clearly good. I think part of the problem was simply the time, and the fact that it's a studio film. So having an ending that would have satisfied us would not have likely past muster at a studio, where it's like, no, the mean bad girls have to get punished for being mean and bad. You know, you can't say you can kill your abusive father and get away with it. That's wrong. You know.
Or that a
Whereas I
rapist
think
would be bald if, you know, if,
Mhm.
if that punishment is too much.
I felt really good reading all of the contemporaneous reviews where every critic was like, that's absurd. They all deserved what they got. So that was cathartic, knowing that people, even at the time, were kind of hip to the conservatism of the message, made me feel better. And that's partially because the third wave was a product of girls who were raised by feminists who taught them the same kind of media literacy that we're talking about right now, right? So when I was doing research on the craft, one of the things that came up was an article where a journalist talked to teenage girls about why they liked the craft. And she pointed out that the movie's kind of conservative. And one of these 16-year-olds were like, yeah, we understand media studies. Like, we get it. We know what's going on here. Right. So it's like the oppositional viewership was already starting to get built in, which allowed it to have, it's not just a cult classic. Like, it wasn't that something that found its audience later. It was a success at the time because of women and girls and outsiders of all stripes. So that's really affirming. I do still think it's important, historically speaking, to point out the failures of these films, because it helps us learn where the edges are politically, like what the mainstream says you can and can't do. Because then when it changes, when in the 2010s you have all of these women doing horrible things and getting away with it in the movies, that tells you that feminism has, like, we've pushed things forward to the point where it's acceptable to show a woman misbehaving in a way that it wasn't even in the 90s, you know?
That's the question.
Beautiful.
Sorry, I have a fly
There's
that will
fly
not
that
leave
just
me alone.
loves us. Yeah.
So I don't think I'm mistaken that you did not spend much time other than like a sentence on Hocus Pocus. Is that right? Okay.
That's true.
Because I almost felt like I missed something when I got like towards the end, and I'm like, did I miss Hocus Pocus analysis? So I'm curious about like why you chose to not really analyze it. To me, it seemed, I mean, obviously, like just my age group, it's like I love the aesthetic and it's very nostalgic, and it's always just been, you know, a big cult following for millennials. But I also feel like the sort of combination of lovable and demonic that they're able to accomplish is kind of unique. I don't see that a lot. So I'm just kind of wondering what your thoughts are on the movie, but also what you thought about the sequel, which was clearly attempting to correct a lot of the problematic stuff from the first movie.
Yes.
So I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I originally had a little bit of an analysis of Hocus Pocus in the book, but I think it's distinct enough from the other stuff I'm talking about, because it's a kids movie in particular, that it didn't feel right to keep in. It is really interesting looking at the sequel and the changes they made, but in terms of Hocus Pocus, it's one of those things where it brings up a lot of the kind of classic stereotypes about witches. You've got these three very different persona. You've got the kind of sexy pinup witch in Sarah Jessica Parker, which is a very traditional figure, right? Like, kind of, you know, I mean, gendered sexist language, but like the kind of ditzy witch, right? Who's hot and uses her sexuality. You have the kind of mean stereotype of the kind of bumbling best friend character. And then you have the more traditionally evil, like, hag figure, and all of these are just, you know, borrowing the kind of stereotyping terms, right? The main character, like the main audience surrogate character, is a guy. He's like a teenage boy in that movie. And I didn't grow up with this movie, so I watched it for the first time and I had no idea. I was like, what are you why is he here? What is he doing here? So yeah, I think it engages in a lot of the kind of more basic kids movie stereotypes around witchcraft, right? With the kind of cannibalism thing and the kids, you know, scaring the kids thing. It's really good. Like, it is a very fun, enjoyable film. But its politics, I think, are a little more in the kind of Wizard of Oz school than in the horror movie school. The fact that when they updated it, were like, okay, it's very clear that the audience does not want a teenage boy protagonist. We're going to put a young girl in this role, and try and find a way to make these witches sympathetic. Speaks to the fact that witches as a feminist symbol have become so pervasive. Like, we all know by virtue of media saturation that, you know, witches are like a historically persecuted symbol for like an actual history of femicide, that they're used against women as a stereotype, and on and on and on. And therefore, in Hocus Pocus 2, they have to be like, no, it was the pressures of the time that made them evil. But even then, they don't know how to square that circle. So you have an audience, or like a friend character in that movie, be like, well, maybe they were, you know, maybe that's why, but at the same time, like, they're still trying to kill us now. So it is, I think Hocus Pocus 2 is a really fascinating thing to look at, to understand that it's hard to make a villainous character sympathetic. And I think as witches, we need to ask ourselves, do we want a villainous character to be the good guy in a very simple way? Or can we gain something from the fact that she is a scary character? Like, a witch has power because she has the power to change things, and the change is scary. So when we turn her into a victim, like, is that helping us?
Especially
so
when she's like actively eating children. You know, I when I watched the second one, I really liked how they pulled in this kind of like modern witchcraft stuff, and the teenage girl starts, you know, she has powers and she has like her crystals in the beginning, and I was like, okay, I see what they're doing. This is cool. But yeah, ultimately they're trying to like redeem these characters who are murdering children since the first movie. So
yeah, it's hard
kind
to
of
square that circle.
Yeah.
And in general, what are your thoughts on this change in children's movies? I'm thinking of like Maleficent coming out, and Maleficent becomes a beautiful, sympathetic, maternal character instead of a terrifying witch. What is that doing overall to us as a culture and as feminists and queer people and witches?
Yeah, I think Maleficent is a really cool example because she's such a character that, you know, millennials in particular, I think, you know, grew up with, and were like, a lot of queer people and oppositional viewers were obsessed with. And so having the next generation of filmmakers kind of carry that character forward and give her a story that explains or works to highlight the oppositional perspective on her is really poignant and cool. And Maleficent came out during the Me Too movement's peak as well. And that movie is about sexual assault and its legacy, right? So I think that movie is really cool for its explicit politics. That's a young adult film that's not afraid to really contend with a lot of the complexities of how women are villainized, and peel back the layers on like why she's a villain and what that means. So she doesn't lose her bad guy status per se. It's just making the revenge she's getting make sense. So I think that one's pretty elegant. And I think it does require a lot of like reading comprehension to understand it, which I love. I like movies that are complicated. I like movies that don't condescend their audiences. So I do think Maleficent is great. I think sometimes movies like that can then get watered down over time as that trend is repeated until you get things like Cruella, which Cruella was a very fun movie, but it was also a very silly movie where it's like, she hates dogs because her mom got killed by a dog. Like,
and she also loves dogs and gave them, I mean, yes, I didn't bring up Cruella over Maleficent for that reason, because it's doing something different.
Yeah. So it started out in a good place. I think we've lost the thread on it at this point. But some of those earlier examples are great too.
Anything over here?
Yeah. That also all makes me think of like, there's the point like where you make the bad witches good again. But in reality, I feel like in anything like, the idea would be that like being a witch, it has nothing to do with whether you're bad or good. Like, you're a complex and full being. So like there will be ones that bad and good is still simplified. But like, yeah, like there's still a person there that can be all sorts of things. But my other question was, is there anything you expected to find in doing this project that you didn't, or things that surprised you? And how did you come out? Like, is there anything you viewed differently at sort of the end?
Yeah, I think the thing that surprised me most during the research process was when I was looking into the 80s, because the Satanic Panic being what it was, I think I really expected to look and find a lot of horror movies about witches. So I think kind of looking at the way horror comedy operates, and understanding how backlash to feminism works to delegitimize women by making them seem frivolous or silly was really clarifying for me. I think that's really helped me enter this moment with the resurgence of like trad wives, right? And a lot of these kind of 80s style, almost Anita Bryant type figures in the culture, right? Where now that I understand and I look at like if the witches aren't in the horror movies, where are they going? If you follow the rage versus the humor, that's helped me situate in this moving landscape to be like better armed to combat the rhetoric that we're facing. Because backlash isn't just calling someone a childless cat lady. Right? It's much more complicated than that. It's trying to be sympathetic. It's like, aren't you tired of working so hard? Wouldn't you rather wear a nice dress than, than like go out and work and like have to suffer because the economy is bad? So yeah, like looking at the way media depicts that kind of shift was surprising, but very useful for me at least.
The section on the 80s really made me want to rewatch Elvira, which I don't think I've watched since I was a kid, and I forgot how awesome she is. And I definitely need to, yeah, I need to revisit that.
Totally.
I only have like a couple rapid fire questions. Okay, so I just quickly want to know, what's your favorite movie that you discuss in the book?
Rosemary's Baby is the one I tell people to go out and watch ASAP because it's so powerful.
Yeah.
It's just such a profound meditation on women and power. And it's just like a kick-ass movie. But Elvira is great. Practical Magic obviously makes me cry. For deeper cuts, if you like something a little funky, I'd recommend Belladonna of Sadness. It's a Japanese psychedelic animated crazy movie. It's like pure art. It's delicious. So those are the ones that jump to mind.
Awesome. And which do you think of the ones you discussed had like the most authentically feminist message, not just veneer?
I think the one I'd point people to that you may not have seen is Eve's Bayou. That movie by Casey Lemons was one of the highest grossing independent films of that year, but she never got the credit that was due to her because she's a Black woman working in film. And it's just really, it's just great talking about family and trauma and looking at magic in a really complicated way, speaking to that other question we had earlier about like, it's not about good or bad, it's much deeper than that. That movie's a really great one for that kind of humanizing thing.
Awesome. My last question was most underrated film, but it sounds like it might have been that one.
Yeah, that one's definitely the most underrated. I'm trying to think if there are any others that deserve more attention. There's a film from 1958 called Bell Book and Candle that when I've spoken to people, like audiences haven't really seen. And it's just a very sweet, fun rom-com. The aesthetic is great. The main witch has black turtlenecks and an awesome cat, and it's very romantic. So maybe check that one out too.
Okay, cool. Anything else, guys?
We really appreciate this. I can honestly listen to you talk all day.
Thank you
You're
so
very
much.
engaging, and I learned a lot through the conversation. The book is so essential in the conversations that we're having kind of across all different areas of what we're going through culturally. So thank you so much for writing it and for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great. All right. Have a good night.
You
too.
too.